Everyone thinks they know Karen Hill. They've seen the movie. They remember Lorraine Bracco. They remember the fur coats, the jewelry, the Copacabana entrance, the long tables at Christmas dinner with all the mob wives laughing and drinking wine. They remember the scene where she holds a gun over Henry while he sleeps. They remember her voice, sharp, tough, a woman who knew exactly what world she was living in and chose to stay anyway. They think they know her. They don't. Here is the first thing you need to understand before we go any further. The Karen Hill in GoodFellas is not the real Karen Hill. She is a version. A simplified, compressed, Hollywood-shaped version of a real woman whose actual life was so much more complicated, so much more painful, and so much more human than anything a 2.5-hour movie could capture. The movie showed you the exciting parts. The restaurants, the money, the danger, the drama. It showed you a woman who was tough enough to survive. What it didn't show you, what it couldn't show you, was what survival actually looked like. What it cost. What it took from her that she never got back. Here is the second thing you need to understand. Karen Hill did not enter witness protection because she was brave. She did not cooperate with the federal government because she suddenly grew a conscience or because she wanted to do the right thing. She entered witness protection because Henry Hill made a decision that destroyed her life, and she had no choice but to follow him into the wreckage. And here is what nobody ever talks about. She resented him for it. Not for a year. Not for a few years. For the rest of the time, they were together. Maybe for the rest of her life. The movie ended with Henry complaining that he couldn't get good spaghetti anymore. That was a joke. A punchline. A way to send the audience home with a smile. The real ending was not a joke. The real ending was Karen Hill living under a name that wasn't hers, in a city that wasn't her home, telling lies to every single person she met, watching her daughters grow up inside a false identity, and understanding with every passing year that the life she had known, the only adult life she had ever known, was gone forever. That is not a punchline. That is a tragedy. And it is a tragedy that almost nobody has bothered to tell. Until now. Before we go any further, I need to ask you something. Drop it in the comments right now. Where are you watching this from, and what time is it where you are? I ask this every time because I am genuinely amazed by where these videos reach. Now, here's what I also need you to do. If you watched the last video, the one about the real story behind GoodFellas, if that video changed how you see GoodFellas, this one is going to change how you see every single person in that story. Hit the subscribe button right now so you don't miss what comes next. And like this video, not because I'm asking you to, but because if Karen Hill's story deserves to be heard, and it does, she spent 40 years with no name, no identity, no history. The least we can do is make sure as many people as possible hear it. Share this with someone who thinks they know the GoodFellas story. They don't. Not yet. Get comfortable. This is going to take a while, and every minute of it is worth it. Most people who watch GoodFellas don't think much about who Karen was before Henry Hill walked into her life. The movie doesn't give you much time to think about it. She appears, she meets Henry, she gets drawn into his world, and from that point forward the movie is about him. She's a supporting character in her own life story. That is one of the things we're going to fix today. Karen Friedman grew up in Woodmere, New York. If you don't know Woodmere, picture this, a quiet, safe, solidly middle-class suburb on the South Shore of Long Island. Clean streets, good schools, families who went to synagogue on Friday nights and had dinner together on Sundays. Woodmere in the 1950s and 1960s was the kind of place where nothing dramatic happened, where the biggest excitement was a high school football game or a new store opening on a main street, where parents worked hard, saved money, and dreamed of their children having stable, respectable lives. Karen's family was exactly that kind of family. Her parents were Jewish, conventional, and deeply invested in the idea that their daughter would grow up to marry a nice Jewish man, have a nice Jewish family, and live a nice, safe, predictable life. There was nothing in Karen Friedman's upbringing that pointed toward mob wives and drug money and federal witness protection. Nothing. She was a normal girl from a normal suburb. And that fact matters enormously when you try to understand everything that came after. This is the thing that always gets lost in the GoodFellas narrative. People look at Karen Hill, the mob wife, The woman who helped move drugs, who screamed at Henry's girlfriends, who flushed cocaine down the toilet when the FBI came knocking, and they assumed she must have come from somewhere dark. Must have had some predisposition toward that life. Must have been drawn to danger from the beginning. That assumption is wrong. Karen Friedman came from exactly the kind of background that should have produced a perfectly ordinary life. The fact that it didn't, the fact that she ended up where she ended up, is one of the most psychologically interesting things about her story. And understanding where she started is the only way to understand how she got to where she ended. Karen met Henry Hill in 1965. She was 16 years old. He was 22. The meeting happened on a blind double date, the kind of casual social arrangement that was completely normal for that era. Two couples, some kind of dinner or outing, see if there's a connection. Simple. Except nothing about what followed was simple. Here is something the movie leaves out entirely. Henry Hill stood Karen up on that first date. He didn't show. She waited, and he didn't come. By any reasonable standard, that should have been the end of it. Normal 16-year-old girl from a respectable family gets stood up by a 22-year-old man she barely knows. You move on. You don't go back. You chalk it up to experience, and you find someone else. Karen went back. That decision, that single decision to give Henry Hill a second chance after he had already shown her exactly who he was, is one of the most important moments in this entire story. Not because it was dramatic. It wasn't. It was a teenager making a choice that probably didn't feel significant at the time. But it set the pattern for everything that followed. It established the dynamic of their entire relationship. Henry would do something that should have ended things. Karen would stay. Henry would push further than anyone had a right to push. Karen would absorb it. And over 20 years, that pattern would build and build and build until it became the architecture of her entire adult life. But why? Why did she go back? This is where we have to think carefully, because the easy answer, that Karen was naive, that she was foolish, that she made a stupid choice, is not the right answer. The right answer is more complicated and more human than that. Karen Friedman was 16 years old and growing up in one of the most boring places in America. Woodmere was safe. Woodmere was predictable. Woodmere was exactly the kind of place that a certain kind of young woman finds suffocating. Not every girl raised in that environment wants what it offers. Not every teenager raised on the promise of a stable, conventional life actually wants that life. Some of them look at the careful, measured, respectable world their parents have built and feel, underneath the safety of it, a deep and restless hunger for something more. Something real. Something that feels alive. Henry Hill was alive. That's the only way to describe what he must have seemed like to a 16-year-old girl from Woodmere. He was 22, and he already carried himself like a man twice that age. He had money. Real money. Cash money. Not an allowance or a part-time job. He had confidence that came from somewhere Karen couldn't quite identify, but could absolutely feel. He had access to a world that was completely invisible from the clean streets of Woodmere. He was dangerous without being obviously threatening, exciting without being cartoonish. He was, in the most straightforward psychological terms, exactly the kind of person that a girl raised inside a safe, controlled, conventional environment would find irresistible. She didn't go back because she was stupid. She went back because Henry Hill represented everything that Woodmere wasn't. And at 16, that felt like freedom. Karen's family saw it differently. Her parents were not happy about Henry Hill. Not even a little. Here was their daughter, their Jewish daughter, raised in a Jewish household in a Jewish neighborhood, bringing home a 22-year-old Italian man from Queens who worked at a cab stand, who had no college education, who had no clear career path, who carried cash in a way that no legitimate 22-year-old should have been able to carry cash. Her parents were not naive. They could see what their daughter apparently couldn't see or didn't want to see. They pushed back. They expressed their concerns. They made clear that they did not approve. It didn't matter. Karen was already drawn in too deep for her parents' opinions to reach her. This dynamic, the parents who can see the danger, the young woman who is too close to it to see clearly, is not unique to Karen Hill's story. It shows up again and again in the histories of women who end up in the orbit of organized crime. There is something about the early stages of that kind of attraction that is genuinely blinding. The danger feels like excitement. The unpredictability feels like passion. The money feels like security. The power feels like protection. Everything that should be a warning sign reads, from the inside, as a reason to stay. Karen's parents could see a young man who was going nowhere good. Karen could see a young man who made her feel more alive than she had ever felt in Woodmere. They were both right. They were just looking at different things. Karen and Henry married in 1965. She was a teenager. He was 22. Her parents attended the wedding. The photographs from that day, if they still exist somewhere, show a young woman who looks happy, who looks like she got exactly what she wanted. She had no way of knowing what she had actually gotten herself into. Nobody ever does. When Karen Hill married Henry Hill, she didn't just marry a man. She married a world. And that world had rules, hierarchies, customs, and codes that she had to learn from scratch because nothing in her upbringing had prepared her for any of it. The world she married into was organized around the Lucchese crime family, specifically around Paul Vario's crew. If you watched the last video, you already know who Paul Vario was, the capo who ran the Euclid Avenue cab stand, a brutal and calculating mob boss who had been using Henry Hill since Henry was 11 years old. What you might not know is what it was like to be a woman inside that world. What the daily texture of mob life felt like for the wives and girlfriends who lived on the edges of it. It was not what the movies make it look like, not even close. The mob wives in GoodFellas are shown as glamorous, funny, loud, and largely in control of their domestic lives. They have nice houses. They cook enormous meals. They go to nice restaurants. They gossip and laugh and seem, fundamentally, to be having a good time. That is one version of reality. The real version had more fear in it, more uncertainty, more of the particular anxiety that comes from knowing that your husband's business could get him killed at any moment, and that you would not be warned when it happened. But here is the thing, and this is the thing the movie actually gets right. Even if it doesn't fully explore it, Karen was not repelled by this world. She was attracted to it. She found a community of mob wives genuinely appealing. There was a social structure to it, a hierarchy, a set of rules that, once you understood them, made a certain kind of sense. The wives knew their roles. They knew the boundaries. They knew what was expected of them and what they could expect in return. For a woman who had grown up in the structure of a conventional Jewish household, there was something about the structure of mob life that was paradoxically familiar. Different content, same framework, and the money was real. That cannot be overlooked or minimized. The money that flowed through Henry Hill's world was not theoretical. It was not a salary deposited into a bank account twice a month. It was cash. Enormous amounts of cash that appeared and disappeared in ways that Karen was not always told about, but that she could see and feel and spend. She went to Bloomingdale's. She bought furniture. She had fur coats. She ate at restaurants that her parents could not have afforded. The life was expensive and exciting and full in ways that the quiet streets of Woodmere had never been full. She was not dragged into this world. She walked in with her eyes open, and she found things there that she wanted. That is not a judgment. It is a fact. And it is a fact that matters enormously when we talk about what witness protection later took from her. Because you can only understand what she lost if you understand what she had. And what she had in those early years was exactly the life she had chosen. The first years of Karen and Henry's marriage were, by most accounts, genuinely good. Not perfect, not without conflict, but good in the way that early marriages can be good when both people are still figuring out who they are together. Henry was making money. Karen was building a home. They moved into a house in Elmont, New York, a neighborhood that was a step up from the cab stand world, but still well within the orbit of Henry's crew. They had neighbors. They had friends. They had, eventually, 2 daughters, Gaia and Judy, who would grow up to understand far more about their father's world than any child should ever have to understand. Karen made friends with the other wives. This is an aspect of her life that deserves more attention than it usually gets. The community of mob wives was real and functional and, in many ways, genuinely supportive. These were women who understood each other's lives in a way that no outsider could. They knew the language. They knew the code. They knew what it meant when your husband came home late, or didn't come home at all. They knew how to talk around things without talking about them. They knew which questions you didn't ask, and which silences you filled with conversation about food, or children, or the latest piece of gossip that was safe to share. Karen was good at this. She learned the rules quickly. She mastered the social codes. She became, over time, a real participant in that community. Not a peripheral figure, not a confused outsider, but a genuine member of a world that had its own complex social structure. This matters because when witness protection later ripped her out of that world, it didn't just take away the money and the house and the husband. It took away the community. It took away the friends. It took away the social structure that had organized her adult life for 15 years. It took away everything she had built and knew and understood about how to be a woman in the world. And it gave her nothing to replace any of it except a false name and a new address in a city where nobody knew her. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before we get to the ending, we need to understand the middle. And the middle of Karen Hill's story is darker and more complicated than most people know. GoodFellas is a masterpiece of cinema. Martin Scorsese's direction, Ray Liotta's performance, the soundtrack, the editing, all of it is extraordinary. But GoodFellas is also, fundamentally, Henry Hill's story as Henry Hill wanted it told. Nicholas Pileggi, who wrote the book Wise Guy and co-wrote the screenplay, worked primarily from Henry's perspective. The result is a film that is brilliant and entertaining and genuinely illuminating about the world of organized crime. But that also, inevitably, centers Henry and positions Karen as a supporting character. A witness to Henry's life rather than a full participant in her own. The real Karen Hill was not a supporting character in her own life. Here is what the movie shows you about Karen's involvement in criminal activity. She knows what Henry does for a living. She enjoys the money. She holds a gun over him one night. She is present during the paranoid final days before Henry's arrest. She is shown, briefly, helping to hide drug-related materials. That is roughly the extent of it, as the movie presents it. Here is what the full record, Pileggi's book, court testimony, and Karen's own memoir, reveals. Karen Hill was a substantially more active participant in the criminal lifestyle than the movie shows. She was not a passive beneficiary of Henry's work. She was involved. She knew more than the movie suggests. She did more than the movie shows. And she understood the full scope of what Henry was doing in ways that the film, which needed to maintain audience sympathy for her character, chose to minimize. This is not about judging Karen Hill. It is about understanding her accurately. Because if you want to understand what witness protection did to her, psychologically, emotionally, socially, you need to understand not just what she lost, but what she was. And what she was by the mid-1970s was a woman who was fully embedded in a criminal world that had become her entire reality. By the mid-1970s, Henry Hill was deeply involved in drug trafficking. This is the period the movie covers in its final act. The paranoid montage of cocaine-fueled days, the guns, the FBI surveillance planes, the feeling that everything was about to fall apart. The movie presents this as primarily Henry's world, with Karen as a worried observer. The documentary Record tells a different story. Karen Hill was involved in Henry's drug operation. This is not speculation. It is documented in court records and confirmed in Nicholas Pileggi's reporting. She helped Henry move drug-related materials. She drove for him. She was present in the operation in ways that went beyond simply knowing what her husband did for a living. She was a participant. Now, it is important to be precise about what this means and what it doesn't mean. Karen Hill was not a drug kingpin. She was not running an independent operation. She was not the architect of anything. She was a woman who was deeply enmeshed in her husband's world, who had been normalized to that world over 15 years of marriage, and who did what was asked of her, or what she felt needed to be done to protect the operation and, by extension, her family. That is a very human thing to do. It is also a criminal thing to do. Both of those things are true simultaneously, and you can hold them both in your head at the same time. The movie shows Karen helping to hide drugs and drug money in the chaotic final days before Henry's arrest. That happened, but the movie presents it as a panicked, reactive moment. Karen scrambling to protect Henry in a crisis. The reality is that Karen's involvement was not limited to a single panic moment. It had been building for years. She had been living inside the operation, understanding it, and contributing to it in various ways for a long time before the final crisis arrived. This matters because it explains Karen's legal exposure when Henry was arrested. She wasn't just the wife. She had her own potential liability. And that potential liability was a significant factor in the decision to cooperate with the federal government, a fact that the movie glosses over almost entirely. Here is something that psychology research makes very clear, and that is absolutely essential for understanding Karen Hill's story. Human beings are extraordinarily adaptable. We can normalize almost anything if we are exposed to it gradually enough, and if the social environment around us treats it as normal. Karen Hill spent 15 years inside a world where violence was a tool, where illegal money was just money, where the rules of ordinary society did not apply, and where the community around her, the wives, the men, the whole social ecosystem of Paul Vario's crew, treated all of this as completely unremarkable. She didn't fall into that world all at once. She entered it gradually, over years, through a process of incremental normalization that is so well documented in psychological literature that it has its own name, the normalization of deviance. Think about what this means in practice. In 1966, when Karen was newly married to Henry, the idea of helping to conceal criminal proceeds would have felt wrong. It would have felt dangerous and frightening and morally troubling. She was, after all, a girl from Woodmere. She knew right from wrong. But by 1976, after 10 years of living inside that world, 10 years of watching criminal money flow through her household, 10 years of socializing with people for whom this was simply the texture of daily life, 10 years of having her moral calibration reset by a world that operated by completely different rules. By that point, the same action would not have felt wrong in the same way. It would have felt like protecting her family. It would have felt like doing what needed to be done. The wrongness would still be there, somewhere in the background, but it would have been buried under layers of normalization so thick that it no longer registered as a crisis. This is not an excuse. It is an explanation. There is a difference. Understanding why Karen did what she did is not the same as saying it was acceptable. It is saying that the psychology of how ordinary people end up doing extraordinary things is more complicated than simple moral failure. Karen Hill was not a monster. She was a human being who had been living inside a monstrous world for so long that the monstrousness had stopped being visible to her. The moment when it became visible again, the moment when the world cracked open and Karen could suddenly see, with terrible clarity, exactly what she had been living inside, was the morning Henry was arrested. But we will get to that. First, we need to talk about the marriage itself. Karen Hill's life as a mob wife was not just about the criminal activity. It was also about a social world that was, in its own way, genuinely rich and complex. The wives of Paul Vario's crew formed a community. They got together regularly, for dinners, for holidays, for the kind of casual socializing that is the fabric of any social group. They had a hierarchy that was as real and as carefully maintained as the hierarchy among the men, even if it was less formally defined. The wife of a made man outranked the wife of an associate. Seniority mattered. Reputation mattered. The ability to cook, to entertain, to maintain a household that reflected well on your husband. All of this had social currency in this world. Karen was good at this. She learned the codes quickly. She understood the unspoken rules about what you talked about and what you didn't. She knew how to be present in a conversation without saying anything that could be used against anyone. She knew how to be warm and welcoming and funny without revealing anything real about what was actually happening in her house or her husband's business. These were skills, real skills, and she developed them over years of practice. The social events in GoodFellas, the Christmas dinner tables loaded with food, the laughing women, the noisy kitchens. Those scenes are accurate in their texture, if not in every detail. The mob wife social world really was that warm, that loud, that full of food and laughter and genuine affection. The women in that world genuinely liked each other, in many cases. They were bound by shared experience and shared secrets in a way that created real intimacy. Karen had close friendships in that world. She had women she could talk to, laugh with, confide in, within the limits of what was safe to confide. When witness protection took all of that away, it took away not just the money and the house and the lifestyle. It took away the community. It took away the friendships. It took away the social world that had been Karen's primary source of connection and belonging for 15 years. And it replaced it with nothing, or rather, with the instruction to start over in a new place with people who could never know who she really was or where she had come from. The loneliness that followed was not just the loneliness of being in a new place. It was the loneliness of having to hide the central fact of your entire life from every person you met. That is a specific and particularly brutal kind of loneliness. And it is one of the most important things to understand about what Karen Hill's life in witness protection was actually like. The movie shows Henry with one girlfriend, Janice Rossi, the woman Karen confronts in that famous scene. The scene where Karen puts a gun to Henry's head while he's lying in bed. It is one of the most memorable scenes in the movie. It shows Karen as dangerous, unpredictable, unwilling to simply be the passive, tolerant mob wife. It establishes her as a character with real agency and real fury. In reality, Janice Rossi was not the exception. She was one instance in a long pattern. Henry Hill had affairs throughout his marriage to Karen. This is not a secret. It is well documented in Pileggi's reporting and confirmed in various interviews and accounts from people who knew the couple. Henry was not discreet about it. The mob culture of that era was extremely tolerant of men who kept girlfriends. It was so common and so openly accepted within the social world of organized crime that it had its own informal set of rules. The girlfriend was separate from the wife. The wife was for family, for home, for the long-term structure of life. The girlfriend was for everything else. This was understood. It was the code. What the code did not account for was what it felt like to be the wife inside that arrangement. Karen knew. She always knew. And the movie's version, where the infidelity is presented as a dramatic crisis, a single confrontation, a temporary rupture, misses the grinding, daily reality of living with the constant knowledge that your husband was elsewhere, with someone else, and that the culture around you expected you to absorb this without complaint. Karen did not absorb it without complaint. The real Karen Hill was not a passive acceptor of whatever Henry chose to do. She fought. She confronted. She was, by all accounts from people who knew her, formidable when she was angry. The gun scene in the movie is not an exaggeration. It is drawn from a real incident. But the movie presents it as an isolated explosion, a single dramatic moment. The reality was that Karen's fury at Henry's infidelity was a recurring feature of their marriage, something that erupted periodically throughout their years together, was never fully resolved, and added layer upon layer of resentment and pain to a relationship that was already complicated enough. By the early 1970s, Henry Hill had a serious cocaine addiction. This is a matter of public record. His addiction was documented in FBI surveillance, in court proceedings, and in his own accounts of that period of his life. The movie portrays the addiction as a central plot element of the final act, the paranoid, chaotic period before the arrest. But the movie compresses time in the way that movies must, and what it presents as a relatively rapid deterioration was actually a much slower process that played out over many years and that fundamentally changed the texture of daily life in the Hill household. Living with an addict is a particular kind of experience that has been well documented by researchers, therapists, and the families of addicts themselves. It is characterized by unpredictability, by the constant management of someone else's moods and crises, by the way that the addict's needs come to organize the entire household around them, leaving everyone else to arrange their lives around the central, destabilizing fact of the addiction. It is exhausting. It is frightening. And it is a particularly isolating experience when the addiction is happening inside a criminal world where you cannot call for help, cannot seek outside support, cannot tell anyone what is really going on in your house. Karen was managing Henry's addiction, its financial demands, its behavioral consequences, its effect on his reliability and judgment, while also managing the household, raising 2 daughters, maintaining the social relationships that were essential to their standing in the crew, and dealing with her own relationship with cocaine, which developed during the same period. This is something that gets very little attention in most accounts of the GoodFellas story, but it is confirmed, and it is important. Karen Hill developed her own cocaine habit during the same period that Henry's addiction was escalating. This makes complete psychological sense when you understand the context. She was living inside a world where cocaine was not just available, but ubiquitous. It was at the parties. It was in the social circles. It was the recreational substance of choice for the entire world she inhabited. She was under enormous stress, managing a volatile, unfaithful, increasingly erratic husband, raising 2 children inside a household that operated under constant threat of both mob violence and law enforcement scrutiny. Cocaine was right there. It offered relief. It offered energy. It offered, temporarily, the feeling that things were more manageable than they were. The movie shows Karen helping to process cocaine in the paranoid final days before the arrest. What it doesn't explore is what Karen's own relationship with the drug looked like over the years preceding that crisis. She was not simply a helper in Henry's drug operation. She was, by the late 1970s, also someone who had her own complicated relationship with the substances that were so central to that operation. Again, this is not about judgment. It is about accuracy and about understanding the full human being that Karen Hill was, someone who was dealing with addiction, infidelity, criminal exposure, and the constant background terror of a life lived inside organized crime, all at the same time. The woman in that situation is more complex and more sympathetic than the movie had room to show. But she is also more implicated, more entangled, more deeply embedded in the criminal world than the movie suggests. Both things are true. The movie shows Karen as the volatile one. The gun scene, the confrontations with Henry's girlfriends, the screaming and the fury. Henry, in the movie, is charming and relatively passive in the face of Karen's anger. He deflects. He talks his way around things. He is slippery rather than directly threatening. The reality was more complicated than this in both directions. Nicholas Pileggi's reporting, which drew on extensive interviews with people close to the couple, paints a picture of a marriage that was volatile in both directions. This is documented territory, not speculation. There were incidents. There was volatility that went beyond Karen's explosions of fury at Henry's infidelity. There was a mutual quality to the chaos of that marriage. It was not simply Henry's negligence and Karen's reaction. It was 2 people who had been living under enormous pressure for a long time, in a world that normalized violence as a tool, dealing with each other in ways that reflected the world they were living in. This needs to be said carefully and sourced precisely, which is why the framing here is drawn directly from Pileggi's book rather than from later, less documented accounts. But it needs to be said because the movie's version, where Karen is the fierce, autonomous woman and Henry is the charming, evasive man, is incomplete. The reality was messier, more human, more painful on both sides. By 1979 and into 1980, the Hill household was living under a level of surveillance and threat that is genuinely difficult to imagine from the outside. The FBI had Henry under active surveillance. They were watching the house. They were watching the people Henry met with. They were building a case that had been years in the making. Henry knew he was being watched. He had known it for a while, and the knowledge of that surveillance, combined with his escalating cocaine addiction, had produced in him a state of near-constant paranoia that permeated every aspect of daily life. Karen was living inside that paranoia. She could see the surveillance planes Henry insisted were circling the house. She was aware of the FBI's interest. She was aware also of a different and in some ways more immediate threat, the threat from within the organization. Jimmy Burke, the man played by Robert De Niro in the movie, was eliminating people connected to the Lufthansa heist. Bodies were appearing. People who had been at the Christmas dinner table were disappearing. The world inside the Lucchese family's orbit was getting more dangerous, not less, and the threat was not just from law enforcement. It was from the people they had been working alongside for years. Karen understood both threats. The FBI could destroy their lives through prosecution. Jimmy Burke and the organization could destroy their lives through violence. She was caught between two different forms of danger, managing two children in the middle of it, watching her husband deteriorate under the weight of his addiction and paranoia, and trying to maintain the appearance of normal life that the social codes of their world required. This is the context in which Henry was arrested. This is the world Karen was living in on the morning of May 22nd, 1980, when the federal agents came. Henry Hill was arrested on May 22nd, 1980. Federal agents had been watching him for months. The arrest came early in the morning at the house. The kind of early morning arrest that federal law enforcement prefers because the element of surprise is maximized and the target is least prepared. Karen was there. The girls were there. The family was home when the agents arrived. The movie does not show this moment with the detail it deserves. It is, in Karen's account, one of the most traumatic moments of her life. Not because she didn't know the arrest was theoretically possible. She did. She had known for a long time that Henry's life was trending toward some kind of catastrophic conclusion. But knowing something is theoretically possible and experiencing its reality are entirely different things. The agents at the door, the handcuffs, the authority of the federal government suddenly present in her kitchen. This was not theoretical anymore. It was real. It was happening. And it was the moment when the world Karen had built over 15 years began to come apart. What she did in the hours after the arrest is documented in Pileggi's reporting. She moved. She made phone calls. She tried to assess what was happening and what her options were. She contacted lawyers. She began to understand the scope of the problem. Not just Henry's arrest, but her own potential exposure, the charges that could be filed, the legal jeopardy she was in. She was not a passive bystander in the hours after Henry was taken. She was a woman trying desperately to understand what had just happened and to figure out what she could do to protect herself and her daughters. And then came the conversation that changed everything. Henry Hill decided to cooperate with the federal government. This decision, the most significant decision of his life and one of the most significant decisions in the history of organized crime prosecutions, was not made in a single moment. It was the product of a process that played out over weeks, during which Henry was held in federal custody, was assessed by prosecutors, and was presented with the stark arithmetic of his situation. Here is what that arithmetic looked like. Henry Hill was facing federal drug charges that carried substantial prison time. He was also facing potential charges related to other criminal activity that the FBI had been building a case around. He was 40 years old. He had 2 children. He had a wife with her own legal exposure. And he had, in the form of his testimony, something that the federal government wanted very badly, detailed insider knowledge of the operations of the Lucchese crime family, specifically about Paul Vario's crew and about Jimmy Burke's activities related to the Lufthansa heist. The FBI offered Henry a deal. Cooperate fully. Testify against Paul Vario, Jimmy Burke, and other members of the organization. Give them everything you know. And in exchange, significantly reduced charges, entry into the Federal Witness Protection Program, and a new life for yourself and your family. Henry took the deal. Now, here is the part that requires very careful examination. Henry made this decision. The decision that would completely reshape Karen's life and the lives of their daughters, without Karen's full understanding of what it meant. This is documented. Karen has spoken and written about this. She understood, at some level, that Henry cooperating meant witness protection. What she did not fully understand, what she could not have fully understood without having been through it, was the reality of what witness protection actually involved. The word protection sounds reassuring. It sounds like something that keeps you safe. It sounds like a solution. What it actually means is total identity erasure. It means giving up your name, your social security number, your history, your ability to contact your family, your community, your social network, everything that connects you to who you were, replaced by a government-assigned name, a new location chosen for you, and a monthly stipend that was, by most accounts from people who have been through the program, barely sufficient to maintain a minimal standard of living. When the full reality of this became clear to Karen, when she understood that she was not simply going to be moved somewhere safe while things calmed down, but that she was going to permanently, irrevocably cease to exist as the person she had been, her reaction was not relief. It was horror. Here is something that needs to be stated clearly, because it is often overlooked in accounts of Karen Hill's story, and because understanding it is essential to understanding her position at the moment of Henry's arrest. Karen Hill had her own legal exposure. She was not simply Henry's wife, standing by the sidelines while her husband made decisions about his legal situation. She had been involved in the drug operation. She had helped move drug-related materials. She had driven for Henry. She was, in the eyes of federal prosecutors, potentially chargeable for activities she had participated in. This means that Karen's entry into witness protection was not purely a matter of following Henry into the program as his dependent. It was also a matter of her own legal situation. Cooperating, or at minimum, not obstructing the cooperation, was not just Henry's choice imposed on her. It was also the choice that kept her from facing her own prosecution. She had skin in this game in a way that the movie doesn't show. She wasn't just dragged along. She was also, in a real sense, a person for whom cooperation was the option that kept her out of prison. This complicates the narrative of Karen as purely a victim of Henry's decision. She was a victim of circumstances, of the criminal world she had been living in, of the choices she had made within it, of Henry's addiction and recklessness. But she also had her own agency in the decision to cooperate, even if that agency was constrained by the reality of her legal exposure. Pretending otherwise would be the kind of simplification that does her story a disservice. Henry Hill's cooperation with the federal government was extensive and extraordinarily valuable to prosecutors. He testified in multiple cases. He provided information about the operations of the Lucchese crime family that had never been available to law enforcement before. He named names. He described operations. He explained, in the kind of intimate detail that only an insider could provide, how the organization worked, who made decisions, how money flowed, and what crimes had been committed. His most significant testimony was against Paul Vario and against various individuals connected to the Lufthansa heist. Paul Vario, the man who had been like a father figure to Henry since he was 11 years old, was convicted based in significant part on Henry's testimony. He died in prison in 1988. Jimmy Burke, the man the movie calls Jimmy Conway, was convicted of murder and died in prison in 1996. The Lufthansa heist case, which had gone cold for years, was significantly advanced by Henry's cooperation. The FBI got what they paid for. Henry Hill delivered. And the price for Henry, for Karen, for their daughters, was a new life that wasn't really a life at all. It was a performance. A permanent performance of being someone you are not. There is a moment, documented in Karen's own account of this period, when the full reality of what was happening landed on her. Not the abstracted, theoretical understanding that they were going to witness protection. The visceral, immediate, bodily understanding of what that actually meant. It was not a single dramatic scene. It unfolded over several conversations with the federal agents and prosecutors who were handling Henry's case. Each conversation revealed another piece of the reality. You will not be able to contact your parents directly. Your daughters will have new names. You cannot tell anyone where you are going. You cannot come back for family events. If someone from your old life dies, you may not be able to attend the funeral. Your old name, your old social security number, your old identity, these things are being retired. You are legally and officially a different person now. The emotional response to this information, as Karen has described it, was not grief in the expected sense. It was something more like shock, a kind of disorientation so profound that it was difficult to process as a feeling at all. This was not sadness about leaving. It was the specific horror of understanding that the person she had been, Karen Hill, grown up in Woodmere, married at 17, mother of 2 daughters, member of a community in a social world. That person was being taken away from her, not by her choice, not on her timeline, not with any kind of ceremony or closure. Just taken, replaced by a stranger with a different name who was supposed to build a different life from scratch. She had 2 daughters who were old enough to understand that something terrible was happening, but not old enough to fully understand what or why. She had parents she would not be able to call freely anymore. She had friends she would never be able to explain the truth to. She had a community that she was leaving without any ability to say goodbye. All of it gone. All of it taken. In exchange for the government's promise that they would keep her safe from the people her husband had just testified against. This was what witness protection actually meant, and Karen Hill had to figure out how to survive it. Gaia and Judy Hill were children when their family entered witness protection. Their ages at the time, young, school age, meant that they were old enough to have established lives. Friends, school routines, a sense of who they were and where they belonged, and young enough that the loss of all of that was genuinely traumatic in ways that child development research has since documented extensively. Research on children who undergo sudden, forced displacement, regardless of the reason, consistently shows elevated rates of anxiety, depression, and identity disruption. The loss of peer relationships in childhood and early adolescence has lasting consequences for social development. The experience of having to lie about who you are to new teachers, to new friends, to everyone in a new environment is psychologically corrosive in ways that are not always immediately visible, but that tend to emerge over time. Gaia and Judy Hill had to do all of this. New names, new school, new city, new story about who their family was and where they had come from. And they had to do it without being able to tell anyone the truth, without being able to grieve publicly what they had lost, without any kind of social permission to acknowledge that something enormous and painful had happened to them. Karen was managing her own devastation while simultaneously trying to protect her daughters from the full weight of it. This is the particular burden that falls on parents in crisis, the requirement to be strong for your children while you are falling apart yourself. It is one of the hardest things a human being can be asked to do. And Karen was asked to do it in circumstances that were about as extreme as parenting circumstances get. Most people's understanding of witness protection comes from movies and television. And most of what movies and television show you about witness protection is wrong. Not deliberately wrong, but simplified in ways that miss the most important truths about what the program actually involves and what it actually does to the people inside it. The U.S. Marshals Service Witness Security Program, officially known as WITSEC, was established by the Organized Crime Control Act of 1970. It was created specifically to address a problem that law enforcement had been struggling with for decades. Witnesses who were willing to testify against organized crime figures were being intimidated, threatened, and in some cases killed, which made it nearly impossible to successfully prosecute mob cases. WITSEC was the solution, a program that would relocate cooperating witnesses, give them new identities, and provide ongoing protection so that their testimony could be secured and they could build new lives. The program works like this. When someone is accepted into WITSEC, they are given a complete new identity, new name, new social security number, new birth certificate, new driver's license, all documentation necessary to establish legal existence as a new person. They are relocated to a new area of the country, typically somewhere far from their original home and from anyone who might recognize them. They receive a monthly financial stipend intended to cover living expenses while they establish themselves. They receive help finding housing and, where possible, employment. They are assigned a U.S. Marshal contact who serves as their primary point of liaison with the program. The U.S. Marshal Service reports that the program has successfully protected thousands of witnesses since its inception and that no witness who has followed the program's guidelines has been killed while under its protection. That is a remarkable record. The program works in the sense that it keeps people alive. What it does not do, what it cannot do, is replace what it takes. And what it takes is everything. Let's be very specific about what entering WITSEC actually costs, because this is the part that is almost never discussed with the granularity it deserves. You give up your name. This sounds simple. It is not. Your name is one of the fundamental building blocks of your identity. It is how you know yourself. It is how others know you. It is connected to your history, your family, your culture, your sense of continuity as a person over time. Being told that you are no longer that person, that the name is gone, that you will answer to something different, that you must learn to respond to a stranger's name as if it is your own, is a profoundly disorienting experience that the psychological literature consistently describes as producing something similar to grief. You give up your family connections. This does not mean you never speak to your family again. It means that contact must be carefully managed, monitored, and in many cases severely limited. You cannot tell your parents where you are. You cannot visit for the holidays without elaborate, marshal-supervised arrangements. If a family member is ill or dying, attending may put you at risk in ways that the program has to carefully assess. The ordinary, casual, unplanned contact that family members take for granted, a phone call when you're thinking of someone, a spontaneous visit, a shared holiday, without federal oversight, all of that is gone. You give up your professional history, your employment record, your educational credentials, your references. All of it is connected to an identity that no longer officially exists. You cannot put your real work history on a resume, because that history belongs to a person who is supposed to be dead. You start over professionally from scratch, often with government-provided cover stories that are thin enough to fall apart under scrutiny, and with skill sets that may or may not be transferable to legitimate employment in a new location. You give up your community. Every friendship, every social connection, every relationship that was built on the foundation of who you really were gone. You build new relationships with people who do not know who you are, which means that every new relationship starts with a lie. And relationships built on lies have a particular fragility that is very difficult to overcome. You give up your past, your stories, your memories that you could share with people. The ability to say, when I was growing up, or my old neighborhood, or people I knew, all of your history is now a secret. Your past is classified. You must talk about the world as if you appeared in it out of nowhere, with no history, no roots, no story. And the silence about your past, the careful navigation required to avoid revealing anything real, becomes a constant, exhausting background task that never stops. The financial reality of witness protection is another thing that movies get consistently wrong. In the films, protected witnesses tend to have comfortable lives, nice houses, adequate resources. The financial picture is rarely shown as a central problem. In reality, the monthly stipend provided by WITSEC was, by most accounts from people who have been through the program, barely sufficient to maintain a basic standard of living. It was intended as a transitional support, enough to get by while the witness found employment and established themselves financially in their new location. It was not intended as a permanent income replacement. And for many witnesses, including for people with limited legitimate employment options, the reality of living on the stipend while trying to build a new economic identity was genuinely difficult. For Karen Hill, this represented an enormous change from her previous life. She had been accustomed to substantial cash flow, not from legitimate employment, but from the criminal enterprise that had supported their household. In witness protection, that income was gone. The criminal network was gone. The informal economy that had sustained them was gone. What remained was a government stipend and the expectation that she would find legitimate work in a new location under a false identity. This is not an insurmountable challenge in the abstract. But in the specific reality of Karen Hill's situation, a woman in her 30s with no legitimate employment history, no professional credentials that could be used openly, 2 children to support, and a husband who was actively making things worse. It was one more layer of difficulty in an already overwhelming situation. Here is something that most accounts of Karen Hill's witness protection experience gloss over, and that is crucial to understanding the cumulative psychological damage of those years. The Hill family was not relocated once. They were relocated multiple times. This happened because Henry Hill could not stop being Henry Hill. He kept getting into trouble. He kept making choices that jeopardized the family's location and safety within the program. Each time Henry created a problem, each time his behavior drew attention, got him arrested, or in other ways compromised the secrecy of their location, the family had to be moved. New city, new name, new school for the girls, new neighbors, new everything. Again, think about what this means in practice for Karen and her daughters. Just when they had managed to establish some minimal semblance of routine, the kids were in school, Karen knew which grocery store to go to, the new name was starting to feel slightly less foreign. it would all come apart again. Another move, another fresh start, another set of lies to construct for another set of strangers. Another season of rebuilding from nothing. The psychological literature on forced displacement and multiple relocations is unambiguous about the effects, particularly on children. Each additional disruption compounds the damage of the previous ones. The ability to form stable attachments is impaired by repeated loss of relationships and environment. The sense of continuity, the feeling that life has a coherent narrative, that past experiences connect to present circumstances, that the future can be planned, erodes with each additional uprooting. By the time of the third or fourth relocation, the very concept of stability becomes alien. You stop expecting things to last, because nothing ever has. Karen went through this. Her daughters went through this. And the person responsible for most of it was the man who was supposed to be her husband and their father. The psychological study of what happens to people when they lose their identities through witness protection, through forced displacement, through the kind of total social rupture that WITSEC represents, is genuinely illuminating and largely absent from public discussion of the witness protection program. Psychologists who study identity formation describe personal identity as existing across several interlocking dimensions. There is the narrative self, the story you tell about who you are and where you came from. There is the social self, the network of relationships and roles through which others recognize and confirm who you are. There is the positional self, your place within the social hierarchies and structures that give life meaning and direction. And there is the temporal self, your sense of continuity across time, the feeling that the person you were yesterday connects to the person you are today and will be tomorrow. Witness protection disrupts all four of these dimensions simultaneously. The narrative self must be abandoned. Your real story is classified. The social self must be dismantled. Your real relationships are gone. The positional self must be reconstructed from scratch in a new environment where nobody knows you. And the temporal self is severed. The person you were before the program is officially dead, and the person you are after has no history, no past, no continuity with what came before. Clinical psychologists who have worked with protected witnesses describe a constellation of symptoms that resembles, in many ways, the symptom profile of complex trauma. Chronic anxiety, difficulty forming new attachments, pervasive feelings of unreality, the persistent sense that the life you're living is not real, that you are performing rather than living. Depression, identity confusion, a specific kind of grief that has no socially recognized name because the losses involved, not a death, not a divorce, but the loss of everything, don't fit neatly into the categories that social support systems are built around. Karen Hill experienced all of this. She has spoken about it in her memoir and in interviews. The language she uses to describe her years in witness protection, the disorientation, the loneliness, the feeling of unreality, the grief that couldn't be expressed, maps precisely onto what the psychological research would predict. She was not weak for feeling these things. She was having a completely predictable human response to an extraordinary assault on her sense of self. Gaia and Judy Hill grew up in witness protection. This means they grew up inside a lie. A comprehensive, total, government-maintained lie about who they were and where they came from. And growing up inside a lie does things to children that are very difficult to undo. The most immediate effect is the one on peer relationships. Childhood and adolescence are the periods during which human beings learn, through practice, how to form and maintain relationships. This learning happens through precisely the kind of social interaction that is most difficult when you are hiding your identity. You learn to be a friend by sharing things about yourself, by being honest about your experiences and feelings, by allowing others to know you and allowing yourself to be known. All of this requires at least a basic level of authenticity. When authenticity is impossible, when the fundamental facts of your life are classified, the learning is impaired. Children who grow up in witness protection, and there is documented research on this, gathered over decades by researchers and advocates who work with WITSEC families. consistently report particular difficulties in their adult relationships. Not in all cases, not inevitably, but consistently enough to constitute a documented pattern. The experience of lying as a baseline condition, the absence of the stable social roots that normal childhood provides, the knowledge that relationships built on your false identity are built on a fragile foundation. These experiences leave marks. For Gaia and Judy Hill, these challenges were compounded by all the other complications of their specific situation. Their father was not a stable presence. Their mother was dealing with her own trauma and addiction recovery. They were moved repeatedly, compounding the displacement of each previous relocation. They were old enough when it started to understand that something had been taken from them, but too young to fully process it. They grew up and they built lives exactly what the program wanted them to do. But the cost of those lives, the price paid in childhood stability and psychological security, was real and cannot be prettified. If you understand who Henry Hill was before witness protection, the compulsive criminal, the addict, the man whose life had been organized around rule-breaking since he was 11 years old, then what happened after he entered the program should not surprise you. But it is still, in its particulars, remarkable in the way that watching a predictable disaster unfold is always remarkable. Henry Hill could not stop. He was in witness protection. He had a new name. He had federal protection. He had, in theory, been given the chance that almost no one in his position gets, a genuine fresh start. The slate, legally and socially, had been wiped. He could have rebuilt something legitimate, could have used the skills he undeniably had, the charisma, the hustle, the ability to read people and situations quickly, for something that didn't destroy the people around him. He didn't. He kept going. He kept doing what he had always done. Within years of entering the program, Henry Hill was dealing drugs again. This is documented. It is not a rumor or an inference. It is in the public record. The man who had just spent years as a key government witness against major organized crime figures, the man whose testimony had helped put Paul Vario and Jimmy Burke in prison, was back to dealing drugs, under his protected identity, while receiving federal protection. This is almost incomprehensible from the outside. Why would someone do that? Why, having been given the extraordinary gift of a second chance, would you immediately start doing the exact things that destroyed your first chance? The answer is addiction, not in the sense of excuse or absolution, but in the clinical, documented sense. Henry Hill was a long-term addict. His cocaine dependence was severe, and severe long-term addiction does not get fixed by a change of address. It does not respond to a new name. The neurological reality of addiction, the way it rewires the brain's reward systems, the way it makes the substance feel necessary for functioning, the way it overrides the rational calculations that should produce better choices, travels with the person wherever they go. Henry Hill in Ohio or Henry Hill in Washington State was the same brain, the same neural patterns, the same addiction that Henry Hill in New York had. The context changed. The compulsion didn't. Henry Hill was arrested multiple times while in witness protection. Each arrest created a crisis for the program and for Karen and the daughters. Each arrest meant law enforcement involvement. It meant potential exposure of their location. It meant scrutiny of their protected identity. It meant almost always a conversation with the U.S. Marshals about whether the family needed to be relocated again. And often it meant exactly that. Another move, another fresh start, another displacement layered on top of all the previous displacements. The government's position on Henry's repeated violations was complicated. On one hand, WITSEC had a clear interest in maintaining the integrity of the program. Allowing a protected witness to continue committing crimes while receiving federal protection was a legal and public relations disaster waiting to happen. On the other hand, Henry Hill's testimony had been and remained valuable. He had testified in multiple cases. He was an ongoing resource for law enforcement, someone with knowledge of organized crime that was genuinely useful. Dropping him from the program entirely, which was the logical consequence of his repeated violations, meant losing a valuable asset. The government, for a long time, chose to keep him in. Each violation was managed. Each arrest was handled. The program bent its own rules repeatedly to accommodate a man who could not stop breaking them. And Karen and the daughters paid the price each time. There is a particular episode in Henry Hill's witness protection years that is so strange, so specific, and so revealing of his character that it deserves its own section. Henry Hill appeared on a television cooking show, on a Food Network program. Under his actual name, Henry Hill, he appeared on camera, was identified by name, and demonstrated how to cook Italian-American food. His identity, his face, his voice, all broadcast to the American public. This is not a rumor. It happened, and it happened while he was in witness protection. The story of how this occurred is a window into who Henry Hill was and why he was, by this point, effectively unmanageable by the program designed to protect him. Henry had, by this point, become semi-public. He had begun to leverage his connection to GoodFellas. The movie had come out in 1990 and had been enormously successful for money and attention. He was doing interviews. He was selling autographed memorabilia. He was, in effect, marketing himself as a celebrity based on his criminal past and his connection to one of the most celebrated crime movies ever made. All of this happened while he was technically in witness protection. The cooking show was the most visible and most absurd manifestation of this pattern. Here was a man who was supposed to be hidden from a mob, from the Lucchese family, from the people he had testified against, from everyone who had reason to want him dead, appearing on national television under his own name, talking to a camera about how to make pasta. For Karen, this was not just infuriating, it was frightening. Every public appearance Henry made was a security risk, not just for him, but for her and their daughters. The mob had long memories. The people Henry had helped put in prison had associates who were still free. Every time Henry's face appeared on a screen, every time his name appeared in a news article, the danger level for the whole family increased. He was not just destroying himself. He was endangering the people who had been relocated with him. The government's response to the cooking show incident was part of a broader reckoning with what to do about Henry Hill. He had become, effectively, impossible to keep hidden. He seemed almost to be deliberately sabotaging his own protection. Or, more likely, he was simply so addicted to attention and so driven by the need for money that the security implications did not register as real to him. The abstract threat of mob retaliation was less immediate, less compelling than the concrete reality of a paycheck or a camera turned toward his face. The cooking show was the most extreme example of Henry Hill's public activity during his witness protection years, but it was far from the only one. By the early and mid-1990s, Henry Hill had become, paradoxically, a minor celebrity. GoodFellas had made him famous. People recognized him, wanted to meet him, were willing to pay money for his autograph, for items he signed, for the privilege of proximity to a real gangster who had lived the life that the movie had made look so thrilling. Henry Hill responded to this attention the way he responded to every other thing in his life, by leaning into it completely and without apparent concern for the consequences. He did radio appearances. He did print interviews. He talked about his past, about the mob, about the crimes he had committed. He made himself available and accessible in ways that were, for a man in witness protection, essentially unprecedented. There is a perverse logic to this that almost makes sense when you understand Henry Hill's psychology. His criminal life had given him identity. It had made him somebody. The mob world had been the context in which he was significant, in which his particular skills and personality type were valued, in which he was known and recognized and respected in the way that he craved respect. When that world was taken away, the GoodFellas movie gave him back some version of it. The movie made his past marketable. It made his crimes into content. It gave him a way to be somebody again in a world that had otherwise reduced him to a nobody with a false name in a city where nobody knew him. He grabbed it. Of course he did. He was Henry Hill. That is exactly what Henry Hill would do. The cost, to Karen, to the girls, to the integrity of their protection, was not something he weighed against the benefit. Or if he weighed it, the benefit won every time. Karen Hill was watching all of this from inside the same protection program. She was living under a false name, in a place that wasn't her home, following all the rules, doing everything the program required of her. and her husband was on television. Her husband was giving interviews. Her husband was signing autographs at GoodFellas events and appearing on cooking shows and making himself famous again based on the story of the criminal life that had destroyed her life. The emotional reality of this for Karen is something that her memoir touches on, but that is difficult to fully convey. Imagine the specificity of that rage. Imagine being the person who gave up everything: your name, your community, your past, your freedom to contact your own family, and watching the person whose decisions forced that sacrifice on you turn those same decisions into a career, into money, into attention and celebrity, and a kind of retroactive glamorization of the very choices that had cost you everything. It was not just unfair. It was a specific, pointed, daily reminder that Henry Hill's relationship to the consequences of his choices was fundamentally different from Karen's. He experienced the consequences as material for storytelling. She experienced them as the conditions of her daily life. He could monetize the past. She was trapped in it. He could talk about what happened and get paid for it. She had to pretend it had never happened. This is the dynamic that led, inevitably, to separation. Karen and Henry's marriage could not survive what witness protection revealed about who they each were. Henry was who he had always been, someone who served himself first, who found a way to make his circumstances work for him, who could not be contained or managed or changed by external circumstances. Karen was someone different, someone who took the rules seriously, who was trying to actually build something, a real life, a stable environment for her daughters, inside the constraints of the program. The gap between those two approaches to life was too wide to bridge. Karen Hill and Henry Hill separated. The precise timeline of their formal separation is not something that has been stated with specificity in all public accounts. And the nature of WITSEC means that certain details of their lives during this period remain private for security reasons. What is documented is that by the mid to late 1980s, the marriage was effectively over. Karen and Henry were not functioning as a couple. The structure of a relationship had collapsed under the weight of everything that had accumulated: the affairs, the addiction, the repeated WITSEC violations, the compulsive public activity that endangered the family, the fundamental incompatibility of two people trying to navigate witness protection in completely opposite directions. The separation was not a single dramatic event. There was no single scene, no final confrontation, no explosive ending to rival anything in the movie. What there was instead was the gradual, grinding recognition that the marriage was finished, that it had been finished for a long time, in certain important senses, and that the formal acknowledgement of that fact was simply the last honest step in a process that had been unfolding for years. For Karen, the separation represented something complicated. On one level, it was a relief. Henry had been a source of danger and instability throughout their witness protection years. His addiction, his criminal activity, his reckless public exposure, all of it had been making her situation worse, not better, for years. Being free of his direct influence, of the immediate chaos that his presence created, was objectively better for her and for the girls. On another level, it meant being alone inside the program. Being a protected witness is isolating under the best circumstances. Being a protected witness who is also a single parent in a place that isn't your home, under a name that isn't your name, with no community and no real social network. That is a particular and brutal kind of isolation. The support structure that a spouse is supposed to provide, the shared burden of daily life, the presence of another adult who shares your history and understands your situation, was gone. And there was nobody else who could fill that role. By definition, there was nobody in Karen's new life who knew her real history. Nobody who understood where she had come from and what she was carrying. She was alone with it in a way that most people never have to be alone with anything. Let us spend some time with the specific daily reality of living under a false name, because this is something that is easy to describe abstractly, but very difficult to understand from the inside. Every morning, Karen Hill woke up as someone else. She answered to a name that was not her name. She had documents, driver's license, social security card, whatever other identification she carried, that identified her as someone she was not. When she introduced herself to new people, She used a name that had no connection to her history, her family, her culture, or anything real about who she was. When someone asked where she was from, she gave a cover story. When someone asked about her family, she navigated carefully around the truth. When someone got close enough to ask personal questions, the kind of questions that friends ask each other, the kind of questions that come with genuine human interest and warmth, she had to perform a life she didn't have. This is not just lying in the ordinary sense. Ordinary lying is temporary. You tell a lie, the situation passes, and at some point the truth is available. Lying inside witness protection is permanent. There is no future moment when the truth will be allowed to emerge. The lie doesn't end. It accumulates. Every new person you meet adds another person who believes the lie, another relationship built on the false foundation, another connection that you cannot afford to deepen too far because depth requires truth. The social science research on chronic deception, on what happens to people who must maintain false identities over long periods of time, is remarkably consistent. It consistently identifies what researchers call identity foreclosure, the shutting down of authentic self-expression as a survival mechanism. Over time, the skills of authentic connection atrophy. The ability to be genuinely known by another person, to allow someone close enough to see who you really are, deteriorates through disuse. The person becomes, in a clinical sense, less capable of intimacy. Not because they don't want it, because the muscle of it has weakened from years of not being used. Karen Hill lived this. Years of performing a false self. Years of maintaining a story that wasn't her story. Years of keeping everyone at a distance that felt safe, which is also a distance that prevented the kind of real connection that makes a human life feel worth living. This is one of the cruelest aspects of what witness protection does to people. It saves your life and then makes that life very difficult to actually inhabit. Karen Hill was not in witness protection as a formality. The threat was real. The Lucchese crime family was real. The people Henry had testified against, and the associates of those people who were not in prison, were real. Mob retaliation against government witnesses is documented. It has happened. The FBI maintains threat assessments for protected witnesses, and those assessments are not theoretical exercises. They are responses to real intelligence about real intentions. The history of mob retaliation against witnesses provides context for understanding why Karen's protection was necessary and ongoing. There have been cases where witnesses were found despite the program's protections. Not many, but enough to establish that the threat is genuine and not abstract. The organized crime families that Henry Hill had testified against had long institutional memories. They had resources, they had motivation, and they had demonstrated through their history that they were willing to use violence to address threats to the organization. Karen's threat level was assessed by the program throughout her years in WITSEC. The specifics of those assessments are not public, as they should not be, but the general reality that she was in genuine danger from people with genuine motivation to harm her was not manufactured. It was real. And living with that knowledge, the knowledge that people somewhere out there wanted to find you, and that your continued safety depended on maintaining the lie of your false identity. The kind of chronic background terror is its own form of psychological damage. The mob retaliation cases that are part of the public record, the witnesses who were found, the intimidations that were documented, the violence that was carried out against cooperators, were not abstract news stories to Karen Hill. They were evidence of what could happen to her. They were the reason the lie had to be maintained. They were the stakes of every choice she made about how close to let anyone get, how much to say, how deep to let any relationship go. Gaia and Judy Hill grew up inside all of this. They became adults inside witness protection. They finished school. They started adult lives. They did what young people do. They built identities, found paths forward, began to establish themselves in the world. But they did all of this carrying the particular burden of their history and the particular constraint of their situation. They grew up knowing things that their peers didn't know. They grew up with a past that they couldn't talk about. They grew up as the daughters of Henry Hill and Karen Hill two of the most consequential cooperating witnesses in the history of organized crime prosecution, without being able to acknowledge that identity to a single person in their daily lives. What is publicly known about Gaia and Judy Hill is limited, which is as it should be. They are private individuals who were placed in an extraordinary situation by circumstances entirely outside their control. They deserve the privacy they have maintained. What can be said, and what Karen has indicated in her memoir, is that they survived. They built lives. They found ways to move forward despite everything that was done to them, everything they lost, and everything they were asked to carry. That is a remarkable human achievement, and it deserves to be acknowledged. Karen's relationship with her daughters during these years, the shared burden of their situation, the particular intimacy that comes from going through something extraordinary together, the complicated dynamics of a family navigating impossible circumstances, is one of the most important and least discussed aspects of her story. The daughters were, in many ways, the thing that kept Karen going during the years when going seemed barely possible. They were the reason to keep performing the false life. The reason to keep getting up in the morning and answering to a name that wasn't hers and building something, anything, that could be called stable enough for them to grow up in. There's a quality to Karen's years alone in witness protection that is difficult to capture in narrative because it is defined precisely by the absence of drama. This is not the exciting part of the story. There are no heists, no confrontations with mob bosses, no cinematic moments that would work as set pieces in a movie. What there is instead is the daily reality of a woman living under a name that isn't hers, in a place that isn't home, telling the same lies to the same strangers, managing the same loneliness, carrying the same invisible weight, day after day after day, year after year after year. This is the part of the GoodFellas story that the movie couldn't show because it doesn't make for good cinema. The grinding repetition of a diminished life. The specific sadness of having been someone and then being required to be nobody. The way that time, when it passes inside those conditions, doesn't feel like healing. It feels like erosion, like something being slowly worn away. Karen Hill went through this. She went through it without the option of talking openly about it, without the ability to seek the kind of therapeutic support that requires honest disclosure of who you are, without access to the community of shared experience that makes hard things more bearable. She went through it largely alone, sustained by whatever internal resources she had managed to preserve, by her relationship with her daughters, and by what we can only imagine was an extraordinary and largely unrecognized resilience. In 2004, something remarkable happened. Karen Hill, a woman who had spent more than 2 decades being officially nobody, living under a name that wasn't hers, hidden from the world in a government protection program, wrote a book. She published her own account of her life. She said, in the most public way available to her, "I existed. This happened. I am real. These are my words. This is my story." The memoir, published under the title that acknowledged her connection to Nicholas Pileggi's original book, was an act of defiance so fundamental that it deserves to be understood as such. Not defiance against any specific person or institution, but defiance against erasure, against the process, governmental, cultural, and narrative, that had spent 2 decades treating Karen Hill as a secondary character, a dependent, an appendage to Henry's story. The book was Karen Hill's declaration that she was not a secondary character. She was the protagonist of her own life, and her story deserved to be told in her own words. This matters beyond the personal. It matters as a statement about how we understand the people around organized crime figures. The women, the families, the people who didn't choose the criminal career, but who were swept up in its consequences. GoodFellas told Henry's story. Wise Guy told Henry's story as Henry told it to Nicholas Pileggi. The 2004 memoir told Karen's story as Karen understood it. That is a fundamentally different document, and it produced fundamentally different information. The memoir revealed things that had not been publicly known or fully acknowledged before. It revealed the complexity of Karen's feelings about Henry. Not the simplified version, the villain who destroyed her life, but the real, human complexity of her relationship with a man she had loved, lived with, raised children with, been betrayed by, been endangered by, and ultimately separated from. Her feelings about Henry, as expressed in the memoir, were not one-dimensional. She was angry. She was also, in some complicated way that she didn't try to rationalize or explain away, still emotionally connected to the history they shared. This is what real feelings look like. They're not clean. They're not easily categorized. They don't reduce to simple verdicts of hero and villain. They're the messy, contradictory reality of having been genuinely close to someone for a long time. The memoir also revealed something about Karen's relationship to the mob life itself that surprised many readers. She did not entirely regret it. This is important to sit with, because it is counterintuitive and because it resists the simple moral framework that most accounts of organized crime want to apply. She had loved parts of that life: the community, the energy, the money, the sense of belonging to something larger than herself. The loss of those things was real loss, not just the loss of the morally wrong parts. This is not a moral endorsement of organized crime. It is an honest human accounting of what it is like to have lived deeply inside a world and then had it taken away. The fact that a world can be simultaneously wrong and be the world you loved. Both things at the same time. Most people who have lived through the collapse of a life they were embedded in, through divorce, through the loss of a community, through any kind of total rupture with a previous existence, will understand this emotionally, even if the specific content of Karen's case is extreme. The memoir also revealed, in more detail than any previous account, the experience of witness protection from inside, the disorientation, the loneliness, the daily burden of the false identity, the specific challenges of raising daughters inside the program, the way that Henry's behavior in WITSEC had compounded the difficulty of everything, the way that the separation from her family of origin, from her parents, from the people who had known her as Karen Friedman, had accumulated over the years into a grief that she had never been given permission to express. The memoir received far less attention than it deserved. This is worth noting explicitly, because it is itself a form of the marginalization that the book was trying to resist. GoodFellas was a cultural phenomenon. Henry Hill was a figure people knew. His story, as told in the movie, as told in countless interviews and profiles, had become part of the American popular culture of organized crime. Karen's memoir, by contrast, was reviewed modestly, sold adequately, and then largely faded from the cultural conversation. It did not make Henry Hill level waves. Why? Partly because it was a book, and books reach fewer people than movies. Partly because Karen Hill was not the famous one. Even though she had been in the movie, even though she had been portrayed by an Oscar-nominated actress, she remained a secondary figure in the public consciousness. Partly, perhaps, because the story she told was less exciting than the original. Less heists and violence and mob drama. More psychological reality. More the quiet, grinding difficulty of a life lived in forced obscurity. But the reception of the memoir is also, more broadly, a reflection of a cultural pattern that is bigger than Karen Hill's specific case. We are drawn to the criminal, to the one who did the things, committed the crimes, lived the life. The people around that person, the family members who were not the perpetrators but who lived inside the consequences, are culturally less interesting. They are a supporting cast. We give them sympathy but not sustained attention. We acknowledge their suffering but don't examine it deeply. The memoir was Karen Hill insisting that this pattern was wrong, that her experience deserved the same depth of attention as Henry's. That what happened to her was not a footnote to someone else's story, but a story in itself. She was right. She is right. And if you're still here watching this, then you're already disagreeing with your presence, with a cultural pattern that made her memoir a footnote. There is another dimension to the memoir that deserves attention. Publishing it was not without risk. Karen Hill was a protected witness. Her safety depended, at least in part, on the maintenance of her false identity. Writing a memoir that identified her as Karen Hill, as the real person whose story GoodFellas was based on, was a decision that had security implications. The decision to publish suggests that by 2004, Karen had made a calculation that the risk of identification was either manageable or that the alternative, remaining permanently silent about her own life, was no longer acceptable. That the need to claim her story, to assert her existence as a real person with a real history that deserved to be acknowledged, outweighed the risk calculus. This is a profound act of self-assertion. It is the kind of thing that happens when a person has been silent for long enough that the silence itself has become intolerable. When a maintenance of the lie costs more than the exposure of the truth. When a human being reaches the point where being nobody, having no name, having no publicly acknowledged story, feels more dangerous to who they are as a person than the physical risks of going public. Karen Hill wrote the book. She put her name on it. She said, "This is who I am. This happened to me. I'm not going to disappear." Before we talk about what we don't know, let's establish clearly what we do know. Because the temptation in a story like this, particularly in the context of a long-form video where the audience is primed for revelation, is to fill the gaps with speculation presented as fact. I'm not going to do that. I told you at the beginning that every claim in this video would be sourced, and that commitment applies here as much as anywhere else. What is confirmed? Karen Hill was alive as of 2004, when she published her memoir. She was alive and giving interviews in the years shortly after the memoir's publication. She has maintained a very low public profile in the years since. There is no credible documented evidence of her death as of the most recent information available. What is confirmed about Henry Hill? Henry Hill died on June 12, 2012. He was 69 years old. The cause of death was reported as complications from emphysema. He died in a hospital in Los Angeles. At the time of his death, he was reportedly in a relationship with someone other than Karen. The marriage had been long over. He died with significant debts. His financial situation at the end of his life was, by multiple accounts, very poor. The man who had been connected to some of the largest cash heists in American criminal history died nearly broke. Henry's death is significant for Karen's situation in a specific legal way. One of the primary threats that had necessitated Karen's protection, not the only threat, but a significant one, was Henry himself, his public exposure of himself, and by extension of his family's general circumstances, have been a constant risk factor throughout the witness protection years. His death removed that particular source of danger. More broadly, the death of a witness's primary threat, the organized crime figures who had reason to retaliate, is a factor in how WITSEC evaluates ongoing protection needs. Paul Vario died in prison in 1988. Jimmy Burke died in prison in 1996. Henry Hill died in 2012. The men who had the most direct institutional motivation to harm Karen Hill as retaliation for Henry's cooperation were gone. This does not eliminate all risk. Organizations outlast individuals, and the Lucchese family as an institution still exists, even in its weakened modern form. But it substantially changes the threat environment. Karen Hill's current whereabouts and circumstances are not public knowledge. This is appropriate. It is the right outcome of a protection program that was designed to give her the privacy and safety to build a life. If the program worked as intended, then the fact that we don't know where she is or what name she is living under is a success, not a gap. What we can reasonably say, based on the documented trajectory of her life and the general information available about how WITSEC works for people in her circumstances, Karen Hill is, in all likelihood, still living under an assumed name. Whether that is the same identity she was given when she entered the program or an identity she has since established through her own choices, people do leave the program, particularly as threat levels change, is not something that can be stated with certainty. Her daughters are adults. They have been adults for some time. Whatever lives they have built them with the full agency of adults making their own choices about how to navigate the legacy of their family's history. Whether they have reconnected with any of their original identity, whether they use names connected to who they actually are, these are private matters, and appropriately so. Karen herself, if she is living as privately as the evidence suggests, has made a choice. A choice to remain quiet, to not continue to call attention to herself, to live, as much as possible, as a private person with a real, private life, not as a public figure, not as Henry Hill's ex-wife, not as the woman from GoodFellas. This is a choice that deserves to be respected, and it is also, in itself, a kind of answer to the question of who Karen Hill is now. She is someone who, having spent years without a name, having been given her name back by her own memoir, has chosen to take that name, her real self, and live with it quietly, out of the public eye, away from the cameras and the notoriety that she never wanted and that cost her so much. Henry Hill's death in June 2012 was widely covered. The GoodFellas connection made it news. The articles that ran were, for the most part, retrospectives on his life, the crimes, the cooperation, the movie, the food show, the celebrity. They were, in many ways, exactly what he would have wanted: attention, even posthumous attention, on Henry Hill and Henry Hill's story. Karen is barely mentioned in most of those articles. She's a fact. Yes, he had a wife. Yes, she was in the movie. Yes, she went into witness protection. A sentence, maybe two, a footnote in his obituary. This is the final irony of Karen Hill's story in the public sphere. The man whose choices destroyed her life got the obituaries, got the retrospectives, got the cultural acknowledgement. She got a footnote. But here's what the footnote misses, and what the obituary writers couldn't see, and what I want you to understand when you finish watching this. Henry Hill is dead. His story is finished. Karen Hill's story is not finished. She is in all likelihood still alive, still living, still the woman who survived. Not just the mob, not just the FBI investigation, not just the plea deals and the witness protection program, but the grinding, years-long experience of having been erased and having had to rebuild herself from nothing more than once. She is still here, somewhere, living a life. A real life. A life that belongs to her. That is more than Henry Hill can say. After everything, here is the question that remains. Who is Karen Hill now? Not the mob wife. Not the protected witness. Not the woman in the GoodFellas movie. Not the person in the obituary footnotes. Who is she now, today, as a human being living in the world? The honest answer is, we don't know. And the honest answer is also, we shouldn't know. Her privacy is not a gap in the record that needs to be filled. It is what she earned. It is what she built. After everything that was taken from her, the name, the community, the history, the choice, she has the right to her own life, lived on her own terms, without the public's need to know where she is and how she's doing. What we can say, what the full arc of her story, taken seriously, suggests, is that she is a person of extraordinary resilience. Not the kind of resilience that gets celebrated in inspirational speeches, not the Hollywood kind that produces triumphant moments and swelling music. The real kind, the quiet kind, the kind that shows up in getting out of bed every morning under a name that isn't yours, in making lunch for your daughters when you have no community and no history and no social support system, in writing a book that says I existed, I was real, this happened to me, and then going back to being quiet, to being private, to living the life you built out of nothing. That is Karen Hill. That is who she is and what she did. And that deserves to be said clearly, at full volume, even if she will never hear it. In every story about organized crime, there are two kinds of victims. The first kind are the obvious victims, the people who are hurt directly, the people who are robbed, beaten, extorted, murdered. These victims are terrible. Their suffering is real and should be acknowledged and named. The second kind of victims are the people who survive. The people who lived through the criminal world, not as perpetrators, not as direct targets, but as the wives, the children, the family members who were drawn into the orbit of that world and had to find ways to keep living after it collapsed. These victims don't get the same acknowledgement because their suffering doesn't announce itself in the same dramatic way. It is not a body. It is not a crime scene. It is a woman living under a false name in an unfamiliar city, trying to explain to her daughters why they can't call their grandmother. Karen Hill is one of these invisible survivors. She's not the only one. Every organized crime case that produced cooperating witnesses produced families who went into protection programs, who gave up their identities, who tried to rebuild from nothing. The Lucchese family cases produced others. The 5 families produced others. The various mob trials of the 1980s and 1990s that used WITSEC to secure witness testimony produced others. We know almost nothing about most of them because the program works by keeping them invisible. Karen Hill became visible, partly through GoodFellas, partly through her own memoir, partly through Henry's compulsive public activity, in ways that most protected witnesses never do. And because of that visibility, her story gives us a window into an experience that is usually completely hidden. She's not just her own story. She's a representative figure for a whole category of experience that the culture has never adequately examined. The U.S. Marshals WITSEC program is, by the metrics it is designed to optimize for, a success. It keeps people alive. The documented record of the program. No witness who has followed its guidelines has been killed while under its protection is a genuine achievement. It represents the government fulfilling a genuine obligation to the people who take enormous personal risks to testify against organized crime. Without WITSEC, the prosecutions that dismantled major mob organizations in the 1980s and 1990s would have been substantially harder, if not impossible. Paul Vario would not have gone to prison. Jimmy Burke would not have gone to prison. The Lucchese family would be considerably more intact today. The program worked. It produced outcomes that made American society meaningfully safer. At the same time, the program as it was designed and operated during the years of Karen Hill's experience reflects certain assumptions about what protected witnesses need that have been challenged by the experiences of people who went through it. The primary assumption is that physical safety is the most important thing, that if you are alive, the program has succeeded. This is not wrong, but it is incomplete. Psychological health matters. Community matters. Identity matters. The capacity to build a life that is not just safe, but actually worth living matters. The program, as Karen's experience illustrates, can sometimes protect the body while profoundly damaging everything else. Modern WITSEC has evolved in response to some of these critiques. There is more attention paid to the psychological needs of witnesses and their families. There is more sophisticated support for the identity transition. There is greater recognition that the human costs of the program are real and need to be addressed, not simply acknowledged as an unfortunate but necessary side effect of the protection. But the fundamental tension remains. The program asks human beings to give up the deepest foundations of their psychological well-being, their identity, their community, their history, in exchange for safety. And then it provides relatively minimal support for rebuilding what was taken. The gap between what is taken and what is provided in return is real. And Karen Hill's story is one of the most detailed and human illustrations of exactly how wide that gap can be. Karen Hill's story is part of a larger pattern that criminologists, psychologists, and sociologists have studied extensively over the past several decades. The experience of women in organized crime families. And the picture that emerges from that research is considerably more complex than either of the two simple frames that popular culture tends to apply. Frame 1, the victims. Women who are entirely passive, entirely without agency, entirely swept up in the choices of violent men. This frame has the advantage of simplicity and has the appeal of moral clarity. The women are innocent. The men are guilty. The women suffered. The men caused the suffering. Clean and clear. Frame 2, the accomplices. Women who are fully complicit in the criminal enterprise, who knowingly benefited from and participated in organized crime, and who therefore bear moral responsibility for its consequences. This frame also has the advantage of clarity. The women knew. They participated. They made choices. The reality, as Karen Hill's story illustrates, is that neither frame is adequate. Most women in mob families exist in a complicated space between these poles. Not purely innocent victims and not fully culpable accomplices, but people who made choices inside heavily constrained circumstances, who were normalized into a world that had its own logic and its own internal justifications, who benefited from the criminal enterprise and in some cases participated in it while simultaneously being its casualties, and who ultimately had very limited ability to exit without catastrophic personal cost. The mobsters' wives and girlfriends have been systematically understudied in criminology relative to the men whose activities generated the criminal records, the court cases, and the documentary evidence. This is partly because women's criminal involvement was often less formal, less documented, less the subject of prosecution. But it is also because there has been less cultural and academic interest in their experience as subjects rather than as peripheral figures in their husband's stories. Karen Hill's memoir was, among other things, an act of resistance against this marginalization. She was insisting on being examined as a subject, as a full person, as someone whose experience of the world was as real and as worthy of careful attention as Henry's. That insistence was correct, and the study of organized crime is incomplete without it. Of all the groups affected by organized crime, the ones who receive the least attention are the children, the sons and daughters of mobsters, the kids who grow up inside the life, who inherit its legacy, who carry its consequences without having made any of its choices. Gaia and Judy Hill are part of this category. They did not choose to be born into the Hill family. They did not choose the mob world their father was part of. They did not choose witness protection. They did not choose the relocations, the false names, the lost friendships, the disrupted schooling, the impossibility of honest disclosure. They were children. They went where they were taken. They lived in what they were given. The research on children who grow up with parents involved in organized crime, and the more specific research on children in witness protection, consistently finds elevated rates of mental health difficulties, relationship difficulties, and identity challenges. Not universal, not inevitable, but consistent enough to constitute a documented pattern. The experiences of instability, secrecy, and forced displacement that these children undergo leave marks. The marks are not always visible from the outside. They often show up in adulthood, in the quality of relationships, in the ability to trust, in the sense of having a stable, coherent identity. What is also documented, and what is perhaps more important to emphasize, children are resilient. Not infinitely resilient and not without cost, but human beings, even young human beings who go through terrible things, have a remarkable capacity to build lives despite those things. The daughters of Karen and Henry Hill built lives. They are adults in the world. Their lives are their own. The legacy of what they went through is part of those lives, but it is not the whole of them. Karen's role in this, her insistence on maintaining whatever stability was possible, on being present for her daughters through the years of chaos and relocation and false identity, is something that deserves acknowledgement. Whatever her failures and complications and struggles during those years, she was there. She kept showing up. She kept trying to provide the minimum conditions her daughters needed to grow and survive and eventually build adult lives. That is not nothing. In the circumstances she was in, it was everything. GoodFellas is a masterpiece of cinema. This has been said and remains true. Martin Scorsese made a film that is brilliantly constructed, perfectly performed, and genuinely illuminating about the psychology of organized crime and the seduction of the criminal life. It is one of the great American films. It is also a film that many people, maybe most people, misread. Scorsese intended GoodFellas as a critique of the criminal life. The film ends with Henry in diminished circumstances, reduced to complaining about pasta and looking directly at the camera in a moment that implicates the audience. We wanted this story, we found it thrilling, and look where it ends. The ending is meant to be a come down, a deflation, the real cost revealed. But many viewers took from the film not the critique, but the glamour. They remembered the Copa entrance, and the music, and the money, and the food, and the camaraderie. They found it exciting. They found the characters, even the murderers, even the most violent and amoral of the crew, exciting. They left the theater thinking that looks incredible rather than that looks like a warning. This misreading is not entirely the audience's fault. The film is so well made, so viscerally engaging, that it is genuinely difficult to hold the moral critique in mind while the entertainment is happening. You get swept up. That is the achievement of the filmmaking, and it is also its limitation as a moral document. Karen's story is the corrective to that misreading. Karen's story is what GoodFellas looks like from the outside of the excitement, from the position of someone who lived the reality rather than watching it on screen. And from that position, there is no nostalgia. There is no excitement. There is only the long, quiet aftermath, the false names and the moved addresses and the daughters under assumed identities and the years of lying to strangers and the grief that had no name and the loneliness that had no end. The movie ended. Karen Hill's story didn't. In the last GoodFellas video, we established something about the men of the Vario crew. Every single one of them ended up in one of three places: dead, in prison, or broken by what the life had done to them. There were no exceptions. Not one man in that world achieved the dream, the wealth, the power, the respect, the good life that had drawn him in. Not one. Karen's story adds a fourth category: erased. Not dead, not in prison, not even broken in the conventional sense. Erased, made into nobody, given a new name and a new address and the instruction to start over as someone else and to never, under any circumstances, be who she had actually been. She survived. She is surviving. But the version of her that survived is a person the world constructed rather than a person she built herself. A ghost wearing someone else's face. A woman who had to recreate herself from scratch in her 40s, in cities she hadn't chosen, among strangers who would never know her real name. This is the outcome that organized crime produces for the people on its edges. The wives, the mothers, the women who didn't commit the crimes but who lived inside the world that did. It is not death. It is not imprisonment. It is something subtler and in some ways harder to acknowledge because it doesn't look like tragedy from the outside. She is alive. She is free. She is fine. Except she had to become someone else to get there. Except the person she was, Karen Friedman from Woodmere, who married a man she found irresistible and built a life and raised daughters and had friends and a community and a history. That person was taken from her. Not by the mob. Not by law enforcement, exactly. By the arithmetic of Henry Hill's choices and the consequences that fell, as they always do, on the people closest to those choices. Every time someone tells the GoodFellas story, in a movie, in a book, in a YouTube video, in a podcast, they make choices about what to include and what to leave out. Those choices are not neutral. They produce a version of events that emphasizes certain things and de-emphasizes others, that renders certain people visible and others invisible, that creates certain emotional impressions in the audience and forecloses others. The dominant version of the GoodFellas story emphasizes the criminal activity, the camaraderie, the violence, the money, the glamour, and ultimately the fall. It is Henry's story. It is Jimmy's story. It is Tommy's story in tragic miniature. It is the story of men, their choices, their relationships, and their fates. Karen's story is the story that gets left out, not because it is less important, because it is harder to tell. It doesn't have the heists and the violence and the power dynamics that make organized crime so narratively compelling. It has something more mundane and more human and, ultimately, more true. The experience of a person whose life was shaped overwhelmingly by circumstances they didn't fully choose and consequences they didn't fully deserve, trying to survive and make something real out of what was left. This is not an unusual story in the broadest sense. Most human lives are more like Karen's story than Henry's. Most human lives are spent navigating the aftermath of things that happened, trying to build something stable from unstable materials, trying to maintain identity in the face of forces that press against it. What makes Karen's version extreme is the specific content: the mob, the FBI, the witness protection program, the false identities. But the underlying experience, the experience of living through the consequences of choices that weren't entirely your own, of losing the life you had built and having to start over, of surviving in the absence of the community and identity that had sustained you. That experience is profoundly human, universally recognizable in its emotional core, even if the specific facts are extraordinary. There is a tendency in our cultural narratives about organized crime to reserve our moral attention for the dramatic moments, the crimes, the betrayals, the violence, the cooperation, the trial, These are the things that produce newspaper headlines and movie scenes and podcast episodes. These are the things that get discussed and analyzed and debated. What doesn't get the same moral attention is the survival that comes after. The long, quiet, unglamorous act of keeping going, of making dinner and taking your kids to school and answering to a name that isn't yours and lying to your neighbors and waking up every morning inside a false life and choosing every day to keep going anyway. This is not considered morally significant in the way that the dramatic moments are. It doesn't produce headlines. It doesn't produce scenes. It just produces years. But the survival is morally significant. The daily act of maintaining yourself, of refusing to be entirely unmade by what has been done to you, of finding ways to remain, in some essential sense, the person you are even when everything external insists you're someone else, is an act of profound moral courage. It is not the courage of a dramatic moment. It is the courage of the long haul. The courage of Tuesday morning and Wednesday afternoon and Thursday evening, repeated hundreds and eventually thousands of times. Karen Hill has that kind of courage. It is not celebrated. It is barely visible, but it is real and it deserves to be named. This brings us to the final point, and it is the most important one. GoodFellas showed us a real world based on real events, populated by real people. It showed us that world brilliantly and vividly, and with a skill that has rarely been matched in the history of American cinema. We are grateful for that. We are richer for having that film. But the film, by the nature of what films are and what they can do, showed us a slice of that world. A particular slice. The exciting slice. The male-centered slice. The narrative that moved fast enough to keep an audience in their seats for 2.5 hours. The people the movie didn't show, or didn't show fully, or showed only as supporting characters in someone else's story, are the people who paid the actual cost. The daughters who grew up with false names. The wives who had no choice but to go into hiding. The family members left behind. Karen's parents, who lost their daughter to a witness protection program that made real contact impossible. The community of women who had built their social lives around a world that collapsed and who had nowhere to go when it did. These people are real. Their experience is real. Their suffering is real. And their survival, the survival of the wives and the daughters and the parents and the people on the edges of the story, is as real and as remarkable as anything in the movie. Karen Hill asked, with her memoir, to be seen, to have her story acknowledged as a story worth telling, to be understood as a full person rather than a supporting character. We owe her, and people like her, that acknowledgement. Not because she was blameless, she wasn't. Not because her choices were always right, they weren't. But because she was human. Because what happened to her was real. Because the consequences fell on her and her daughters in ways that were profound and lasting and deserved to be examined with the same care and attention that we give to the exciting parts of the story. The movie ended. Karen Hill's story didn't. That is the part nobody talks about. And now you know it. I want to say something to you before we wrap this up. You just spent a long time with this story. You chose to stay. You chose to go deeper than the movie, deeper than the headlines, deeper than the version that ends with Henry complaining about pasta and a laugh track. That choice matters. It matters because Karen Hill has been a footnote long enough. It matters because the women in these stories have been supporting characters long enough. It matters because the children who grew up inside witness protection have been invisible long enough. And every person who watches this video all the way to the end is, in some small but real way, choosing to disagree with the cultural pattern that made them invisible. So I want to ask you something in the comments. Not the usual what did you think question. I want to ask you this. Before you watch this video, how did you think about Karen Hill? Not the character, the real person. Did you think about her at all? And now, has something shifted? Tell me in the comments. I read every one of them. I mean that. Here is what I need you to do right now. If this video reached you, if Karen's story landed for you in the way it deserves to land, share it. Send it to someone who thinks they know the GoodFellas story. Because they don't. Not yet. Not the whole story. This is the part they're missing. And the least we can do for a woman who spent 40 years with no name is make sure as many people as possible hear hers. Like this video. subscribe to this channel because this channel is committed to doing exactly what we did today. Going deeper, going into the real story, finding the people who got left out of the official version and telling their story with the care it deserves. That is what this channel does. And if you want more of it, subscribing is how you make sure you get it. Henry Hill is dead. His story is finished. Karen Hill is still out there, somewhere, living under whatever name she has chosen for herself, building whatever life she has managed to build from the wreckage of everything that was taken from her. Her story is not finished, and that is the part nobody ever told you. Until now.